Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 19 of the regular season, in which the Sharks have won 6-2 versus the Colorado Avalanche. So a massive response after the other night's pretty heartbreaking loss against the St. Louis Blues. The Sharks actually replicate the same amount of goal scoring, going from 6 goals to again 6 goals, but instead of letting in 7 like they did against the Blues, they only let in 2. So of course it goes from being that heartbreaking loss to an actually very good statement win and potentially the Sharks' best game of this season. I don't think that's necessarily that controversial to say, especially when you consider their opponent in this one being the Avalanche, who are of course a very strong team. Now this one started out in the first period. The only goal scored was from the Avalanche side. Sam Girard would make it 1-0 Avalanche, but it wasn't necessarily that bad of a first period. While the Avalanche, you could say, were maybe the slightly better team, had the ice slightly tilted in their favor, the Sharks certainly were hanging around with them. And so I've seen a lot of people with the sentiment, even though the Sharks looked relatively competitive with the St. Louis Blues during that 2-game series, I saw a lot of the sort of idea that the fact that the Blues had so many injuries was really the only reason why the Sharks were actually even relatively competing with them. And while the Avalanche do have a couple of injuries themselves, especially on the back end with both Makar and Byram being injured for tonight's game, they do still have McKinnon, they do still have Landeskog, Rantanen, most of their forwards here, insane depth at forward, and the Sharks still managed to skate pretty well with them. Come second period, the Avalanche would widen their lead to 2 goals by getting one from Landeskog, and a 2-0 lead for the Avalanche maybe would have seemed somewhat insurmountable, even though the 2-goal lead is one of the most dangerous leads in hockey. The Avalanche, being how good of a team they are, and with the Sharks maybe not being that great at this point this season, it seemed like it could be over, but the Sharks really definitely fought back significantly. They got one from Shemek just a couple minutes later to cut into the lead, and before the end of the second period would get one from LeBanc, and we'd have a tie game at 2 going into the third. And in the third period, the Sharks really got things rolling. They got a pretty lucky one from Rudolph Balcers to take the 3-2 lead, but then Erik Carlson's first of the season to make it 4-2. Then they got Leonard on a breakaway to make it 5-2, and eventually an Evander Kane empty netter to end the game 6-2. And so just a wonderful game from the San Jose Sharks to get this regulation win. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones. He comes back into the net and he has a massive statement game, especially after the previous one where Devan Dubnyk gave up all 7 goals. It was a disaster of a night for Devan Dubnyk. Martin Jones had the opportunity to not just come in here and play better just for the Sharks team as a whole, but also to send a message to Bob Booner, head coach of the San Jose Sharks, that he is the starter for this team, and that's exactly what he ended up doing. Obviously, Martin Jones has been extremely inconsistent this season, and just because this victory ended up going very well for him, it does not mean that every other game for the rest of the season is going to go very well for him. You know, I could sit here and say, well, I hope Jones plays this well for every other game. Everyone, I would say, knows that's probably not going to happen, but it was very nice while it lasted. Of course, Jones with a very solid game, didn't have much of a chance on the Landeskog goal, as this one ends up deflecting off of Landeskog himself in front, straight to his stick, and able to push that one in. The Sam Girard one, I guess he technically had a chance on, but this was a great move by Sam Girard, and pretty poor coverage from Mark-Edouard Vlasic as well, with a good change of the angle from Girard. But otherwise, Martin Jones with multiple key saves, and it was those key saves that I mentioned a couple games ago that the Sharks weren't necessarily getting. You know, a couple of those goals, if Jones had let in, it really could have shifted the momentum. Could the Sharks have really scored 6 unanswered if Martin Jones had let in a couple here or there? We could have another St. Louis game on our hands, technically, with like a 6-5 score or something like that. But Jones really held down the fort and really helped secure this win for the Sharks. And next, I have a lot of players I wanted to mention. I couldn't really just limit it to 2 or 3, so let me just start here with Timo Meyer, who, interestingly enough, has really picked up his game since Hertl has gone down with the injury. His line has gotten objectively weaker. Before it was Meyer, Hertl, and Balcers. Now it is Meyer, Balcers, and Gambrell centering that line, and yet Meyer seems to be playing up in that role, just been playing exceptionally well in these past couple of games on the offensive side at the very least, but also on the defensive side somewhat here tonight. Timo Meyer just making plays happen, some great passes in this one, and just looking a lot better, which is great for the Sharks because Meyer was supposed to be one of their best forwards coming into the season, and he hadn't yet been up to really this point. Next, I'll talk about Evander Kane. Now, Evander Kane has been an extremely inconsistent forward for the San Jose Sharks, not just this season, but for his entire tenure as a San Jose Shark. Now, it's been quite acceptable usually, because by the end of the season, Evander Kane has been still like a close to, or if not, yes, 30-goal scorer and 60-point scorer on the year. But Kane, usually his points come in droves. 10 games he'll look good, then 10 games he might not look that good. And that's usually because Evander Kane is a scorer, and he doesn't necessarily have like the greatest shot like an Alex Ovechkin, but he's got a very nice shot that will occasionally find the back of the net and occasionally will not. And so even in those stretches of games where he's looking very good, it's usually because his shots just so happen to be going in at that point. So even though he has 8 goals in 10 games, he isn't necessarily looking fantastic with those 8 goals in 10 games. He's just looking pretty good and getting some nice shots away. But this has probably been one of his best stretches as a San Jose Shark within the past month or past few weeks at the very least. Just in general, this line of Kane, Couture, and Labanc has been fantastic. Really the best line for the San Jose Sharks by far in the past few weeks. And Kane has been a huge part of that. There was obviously, when the Sharks first acquired him back at the 2018 deadline, his stretch of games prior to the playoffs that year was very, very nice. He scored 4 goals in one game during that stretch. But these past few games has not only just been him scoring points and scoring goals like by happenstance. He's been working really hard, doing a lot of the little things, getting some great defensive plays as well, and Evander Kane looking a lot better thus far in these past few weeks. And I should also say, there has been a lot of negative energy around the San Jose Sharks this season, and a lot of people talking about some really bad contracts that the Sharks have: Carlson, Burns, Martin Jones, and to an extent those things can be true, but it also has been bleeding out a bit into some of the contracts like Evander Kane's, for instance. And I've really of the personal belief that Evander Kane's contract isn't actually all that bad and is actually pretty decent, along with Logan Couture, in terms of the 2 big contracts for the Sharks that I would say are quite good. Evander Kane is only going to take him to around age 33 or 34 on this 7-year deal. $7 million isn't a ton to be paying a 30-goal scorer, and Evander Kane is definitely a heart and soul kind of guy. He's really a physical type of player that the Sharks absolutely need, and while he definitely crosses the line a few too many times in these past few weeks where I said he has been a lot better, he hasn't really crossed that line all that much, if at all. And so Kane really looking great and has been one of the Sharks' best players along with Logan Couture in these past few weeks, as I've said multiple times now. Next, I'm going to talk about John Leonard. He was a player who I wanted to talk about here tonight, even if he hadn't ended up scoring this goal to make it 5-2 for the Sharks. Leonard, at the start of the year, I can't even tell you how many games he actually played before getting sent back down to the AHL, because after that first game where he scored 2 assists, he was more or less invisible for the next few that he did play. But he eventually worked his way back up into the lineup, and especially on this line with Patrick Marleau, he has been looking a lot better. He's been finding himself in the correct areas, and while he hasn't necessarily been able to bury those chances, here tonight he had a couple of missed opportunities. One chance was fantastic for him, but he ended up fanning on the shot somehow. But in the end, it's nice to see him actually get rewarded with that breakaway goal, and a pretty nice move at that, and some solid speed exhibited by John Leonard. So now with 3 goals on the season, this was the Sharks forward rookie who probably had the most promise at the very least coming into the season. He didn't have a ton of promise, right? The Sharks prospect pool is not that great, but John Leonard was probably the one with the most promise, and he has been delivering at the very least somewhat on that, at least in these past few games especially. Next, I'll be talking about Nikolai Naisov here for the San Jose Sharks. When Carlson and Shemek went down with injury, he was forced to step into a much more expanded role with the San Jose Sharks, getting close upwards of 20 minutes a night, actually. But in these past couple of games, with the return of Carlson and Shemek into the lineup, Naisov's ice time has dropped down to around the 13-minute mark, which I would normally have a big issue with, kind of saying how you're rewarding a player who's been playing quite well and has done well in relief by demoting his ice time by like a third. However, while I was definitely quite appreciative of Naisov's game a couple of weeks back, I do feel as of late it has gotten a bit shaky. At the start of the season, the first couple of games for Naisov, there were some rookie mistakes that we were hoping he would be able to clean up, and he absolutely did. He built a ton of confidence in himself, but it's almost as if in the past couple of weeks, especially in Carlson and Shemek's absence, he had almost too much confidence, or instead of going for the very simple plays that were working extremely well for him back near the start of the season, he kept going for two kind of fancy type of passes. Instead of, let's say, reversing to his defensive partner for an easy breakout, he would try to go up the ice, which is something that, he doesn't necessarily have the offensive skill and awareness to do. It's something that you would see maybe Brent Burns and Erik Carlson attempt, and even when those two defensemen attempt it, they get burned more often, well, maybe not more often than not, but they get burned semi-frequently doing those plays. So Naisov, it was definitely shaky to watch it at times. So I think this is a good thing to see his ice time take that step back, to tell him, maybe settle that game a bit, get back to the simple plays, and you will be rewarded with ice time as we go down the line in this season, especially with how cramped the games are getting. The Sharks play again on Wednesday, and then they have a back-to-back on Friday and Saturday. You can't keep playing Brent Burns 30 minutes a night with this type of schedule. And finally, the last player who I wanted to mention was, of course, Erik Carlson. He had returned from injury in the previous game against the St. Louis Blues. He looked very good offensively. His defensive game was still pretty solid, I would guess, in that game, but it was mostly his offensive game that really stood out against the St. Louis Blues. But here tonight, he was spectacular, far and away his best game of the season for the San Jose Sharks, in my opinion. Not only was he a force to be reckoned with offensively, but he was actually making multiple great defensive plays. So I don't know what this injury was for Erik Carlson. Maybe it was a groin injury that actually popped his groin back in place or something like that. I'm not necessarily a doctor here, so I don't exactly know what could have possibly happened. But Carlson has been looking a lot better in these past couple of games, and this is a great thing for the San Jose Sharks, because with the Erik Carlson injury and then maybe return, it seemed as though maybe he returned a bit too fast to the lineup. There was definitely thoughts in the back of my mind that Carlson was being rushed back into the lineup once again, and he was not going to look all that great here for the rest of the season, as he would never fully heal or things like that. I have flashbacks to what happened a couple years back in the 2019 season when that exact thing occurred, when that exact situation occurred. But Carlson has silenced those doubts in my mind by playing spectacularly this game and in the previous game as well, maybe to a bit of a lesser extent. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Wednesday. They'll take on the Colorado Avalanche once again. And of course, the Avalanche, an extremely strong team, an extremely resilient team. We saw this team take the San Jose Sharks back in 2019 to a 7-game series, and this was before the Avalanche really exploded as a real contender in this league. And so we know the Avalanche will have a very good response in that one. We'll see if the Sharks can keep up with them again. Class dismissed.